before I begin, I just wanted to acknowledge the Dish with One Spoon territory, which is a treaty between the Haudenosaunee, Mississaugas, and the Anishinaabe people here across Toronto in this area. And also to remind you that CSSE is housed on the traditional territories of the Algonquin. So to recognize that we're visitors both here and there on their territories. So I'm really excited today to celebrate the special capsule that has some of our different colleagues presenting their perspectives on the past in terms of CJE and its 40th anniversary and what they've done. And I brought actually Tim let me go into the basement of CSSE and take out, but he said, please bring them back. They're the last of the hard copies that he has. So the original, the first issue, volume 1, number 1, printed in for 1976, and back then you can see the logos, the different colors and the maple leaf on it. But in the first editorial, Ragsdale had mentioned that what he'd hoped the journal would do would give scholars across Canada, educational scholars across Canada, a place to develop and support and sustain educational research that was Canadian. And so I want to thank our panelists today, who are three amazing scholars in their own right, carrying on the tradition of the scholars that have come before them to help sustain the journal. Part of the journal, the special capsule, there's some historical pieces by Don Fisher, and then that looks more broadly at the tensions and debates that informed the journal in terms of whether it could financially be sustainable, and going back and forth between shirked to funded, and editorial perspectives on what kind of research should be published or not published, and debates around that, and different intellectual turns in terms of how the larger intellectual turns across university and academic disciplines then informed intellectual turns within the journal itself. And so we have Don Fisher looking at that, and William Bruno talking as an editor, and Stéphane Allard qui aussi regarde comme rédacteur ou rédactrice, a more microscopic perspective as editor. And then there's a shift in the journal, the special capsule, to our panelists today. And so there's a real call, and what I felt in terms of reading the collection, there's a real call for doing educational research that matters. And so and how do we do that? And today, Carol Campbell from the University of Ottawa, from OISE and the University of Toronto, is going to present on her research on why Canadians need to write different kinds of narratives about our own research and not let international assessment organizations do that for us. And then making a case for why that's important in terms of making a difference in lives of teachers and students in the classroom. And we have Thérèse Laferrière qui va partager son recherche sur un réseau à loin, avec puis plus de ça, le développement novatrice d'une équipe de recherche d'intervention, puis l'importance que l'équipe peut faire pour travailler avec des différentes communautés de praxis dans les écoles ou au niveau du ministre, ou aussi avec educational administrators. And just the complexity and using activity theory to be able to do that. And then Joel will share his work on bringing us back to, again, the concept of why research matters, and drawing on his own life experience as a former social studies teacher to illustrate the messiness of the classroom and what we need to think more carefully about if we're going to talk about democratic institutions, the common good, and research that matters. So without further ado, I want to hand it over to Carol.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you for being here, and I want to thank the Canadian Journal of Education for inviting me to contribute to the 40th anniversary edition. I was quite touched to be asked. And when the call came to say would I write something for the Canadian Journal of Education, the theme around the big picture of educational research here in Canada linking to CSSE. And I was asked to write something about where does Canada stand in the world with regard to education and with regard to research, which is quite a big ask to think about. How do you frame that in terms of a journal article? And this was last summer, fall time, at which point I was right in the middle of a study of teachers' professional learning in Canada with my colleagues in the room here, Pamela Osmond-Johnson, Brenton Faubert, Jackie Son, and a larger team. So of course I was thinking about teachers' professional learning in Canada, and then the question around where does Canada sit within the world. So the article that I wrote reflected on that research that we were engaged in as well as my wider work, and it's called Developing Teachers' Professional Learning, Canadian Evidence and Experiences in a World of Educational Improvement, and it's available in the journal for you to read. So as I said, I'm going to cut to the conclusions because I only have 15 minutes, so if you want the details, go read the article, but I'm just going to go to the conclusions. And as I reflected on the research that our team were involved in, I came to three main conclusions about this question of Canada's big picture of educational research and where we sit in the world. My first conclusion is the importance of learning from, with, and for Canada. And where does CSSE and the Canadian Journal of Education fit within that picture? My second conclusion is that diversity is our greatest strength. We are a highly diverse country. That is our strength. However, inequities are our greatest challenge, persisting systemic inequities and that unanswered and unresolved questions that we have. So, using the example of the State of Educators' Professional Learning in Canada study, which I'm delighted, we published the final report on Friday evening, just in time to be here, so that's why we're smiling today. So the full study was funded by Learning Forward, and it's available on their website freely to download if you want the details of this. And as I said, there was a team of, as myself, Pam Osmond-Johnson, Brenton Faubert, Ken Zeichner from the University of Washington, Audrey Hobbs-Johnson from British Columbia, Sherry Brown, Paula Da Costa, Shari Hales, Larry Kuhn, Jackie Son, and Karen Stephenson. And if you know those names, they're actually a combination of people that work in universities, graduate students, one's a superintendent, and several are working in the research department of the BCTF, the Teachers Federation. So we actually had a research combination that brought together research and practice to investigate this question. And the question around teachers and teacher development and teacher learning and teacher leadership has become a real hot topic. So this is one quote from Hargreaves and Fullen from their professional capital work. Teaching is at a crossroads at the top of the world. Never before have teachers teaching and the future of teaching had such an elevated importance. But we argue this is a mixed blessing because it depends how people respond to this issue. And what we wanted to know was what was happening here in Canada. So the research question was, what's the current state of educators' professional learning in Canada? Firstly, why is a study like this needed? Secondly, what does the existing research literature tell us on this topic? What can be identified from new research about educators' experiences? How are school and system leaders supporting professional learning? What are the enabling conditions? And what implications arise? So the question of why do this study? Well, the truth was that Learning Forward had funded Linda Darling-Hammond back in 2009 to conduct a study of professional learning across USA. And then Learning Forward were hosting their annual conference in Vancouver last year, and there was a bit of we better have some Canadian research because we're going to be in Canada. So we were asked to look at the same question around professional learning here in Canada. But what struck me and the team as we moved forward through this work was actually the why became really about the process. We ended up with a national advisory group with people from each province and territory, and we ended up in really rich discussions about sharing different experiences, very different experiences within and across Canada. And the other why became that other people were telling our story for us. And given that there is a lack of pan-Canadian data, there was little actual pan-Canadian research, although there's of course lots of Canadian research. So we began to engage in this process. So my first reflection, the importance of learning from, with and for Canada. All of these publications talk about Canada. They talk about the importance of Canada's educational performance on PISA, on TALIS, on OECD rankings. They talk about particular provinces in Canada. None of them were written in Canada. So then that's not a criticism. Of course, there's Hargreaves and Shirley there, and Hargreaves is a Canadian and does great work here. But we have a narrative by McKinsey, by OECD, by other organisations about what's happening in Canada, contrasted with actually showcasing our own research. So we began to say, what are we learning? And you won't be able to read this, but this is part of the reference list from the article. These are all Canadian authors. So my argument's not that there's a lack of research in Canada, but it's how do we showcase that research on an international stage as well as nationally and locally. And then indeed in my own work, we started with a question about teacher learning here in Ontario, which led to a bigger question to be involved in an international study where we looked at Ontario and Alberta, which then led to this question about what about across Canada. So you see how the question evolves and moves. So, the importance of raising up our voices, our evidence, our experiences. And one of the pieces of this is about building relationships to make this work relevant within and across Canada. At each step in the process, we have worked with large teams. We've worked with teams including the Canadian Teachers Federation, the Canadian Association of Principals, politicians, researchers, all of these combinations. Each time we've released a part of the study, there's case studies of Alberta and British Columbia and Ontario. We've worked with teams. We've presented in teams. And that's meant that the research has been grounded in listening to and learning from the experiences of teachers and teachers' organisations. However, working in teams is not always easy. And thinking about how you bring those relationships together and how we bring this piece together. So we had to balance the need to spend a lot of time in building relationships with ensuring that we actually were doing a research project. And balancing that piece around when we wanted to actually try and hold up the mirror of what we saw and balance the different voices. So for those of you that want to read this study, we engaged in a whole series of research, of interviews, focus groups, case studies, surveys, analysis of existing data, drawing on our advisory group to provide access to previously not public data, and to say again what is happening uniquely within Canada. So we looked at the existing literature, but then we looked at what does this look like across Canada's different communities and contexts. And I won't go through all of the findings in the interests of time, but the two of the biggest findings link to my next two reflections and conclusions. Diversity is our greatest strength. We heard it and we saw it, and we have a range of data and evidence connected to this. And this is taken from the article and from the work. Professional learning is a mosaic of diverse experiences, opportunities and activities here in Canada, and we conclude that there is no one-size-fits-all approach, and nor should there be. So there are professional development research that come up with a model and a certain number of points and plans. We didn't. We actually said that the variety is important, differentiated to teachers' needs, to their students' needs, to their communities' needs, to their career stage, and all of those pieces. We saw that diversity in rural and remote areas, and thinking about working with Indigenous communities, of teachers with different knowledges and experiences, of changes in curriculum, all of those pieces. So we argue, and I argue, that type of variation is appropriate. It's professional to let professionals lead their professional learning. It's beneficial and it's positive. And then thinking about this from a research perspective, what I argue in the article is that we also should appreciate our diversity, and we should value that and champion it and hold on to it. We know that in some countries, in some contexts, the type of research that's been funded is narrowing and narrowing and narrowing to particular methods or particular questions. So thinking about our research topics, our findings, our epistemologies, our stances, our methodologies, and how at events like this we can honour and respect each other's contributions in different ways. And I actually think for CSSE we need to be vigilant about valuing that in the work that Shirk and others do, that we don't want one methodology or one gold standard or one form of randomised control trials. We need a full range. And then my third and final reflection is that while variation's good, inequity is our persisting and greatest challenge. So while variation can be appropriate, inequities in access, resources, opportunities and outcomes are not. And we heard this. We heard this in focus groups in Manitoba. We heard it in events and experiences in Alberta and in other places. We saw significant differences in what teachers had access to, and that has implications for their students. We heard of teachers who could access less than $100 of professional development in a year, other teachers who had access to over $2,500 in a year. We saw differences between urban and rural areas in the cost of actually getting out of your school if you're in a remote community, or supply cover, or the cost of travel. We heard differences in terms of Anglophone and Francophone systems and what was available for Francophone communities. We heard differences for teachers at career stages, that if you're in your first to 5 years of teaching, the costs of getting out can be extremely difficult. We had challenges of lack of provincial professional development for teachers who didn't have a permanent contract, but who actually need support in advancing their work and their career. So that type of variation is not inevitable, it's not desirable, and it has highly negative consequences. This is an equity issue for our professionals as well as for our students. So my argument would be, and my conclusion in the article, is that we, as a research community and as an applied research community, actually have a vital role in holding up the mirror, however we do it, qualitatively or quantitatively or theoretically or conceptually, to saying where are these inequities and actually talking about them and saying how can we come together to say what can we do for students, for educators and for communities in seeking to address our challenges together in Canada and for a world of educational improvement. So thank you.
En me préparant pour un article dans le 40e anniversaire, je me suis dit, qu'est-ce qui est le plus approprié de mentionner? Sur quoi je dois me pencher? Et assez rapidement, ce qui est venu, c'est innovation. Il faut parler d'innovation. Je me suis dit, je consacre mon texte à l'innovation. Why innovation? If innovation is a solution, what's the problem? Well, we still have the same problem. How we connect research and practice. It's still so difficult to do. And innovation is so difficult. It's difficult when it comes to students who learn in school, adults who learn through their professional lives, as well as us as teacher educators. It's difficult to take the research result of our colleagues and apply it in our own pedagogical endeavors. It is just very difficult. So I'm going to spend my few minutes here talking about how difficult it is, innovation. And this is what the article is talking about. Of course, there are some successes, but also at one point, we know that there are limits. And this is what I want us to think about. Well, when Anne Brown in '92 came up with an article on design experiment, she was saying, well, in EdSci, we cannot do only work in laboratories within universities. The laboratory has to be the regular classroom. And then she started talking about design experiments. In French, avec Alain Breleux, dans la revue des sciences d'éducation, nous avons traduit cela par expérimentation de devis. But very quickly, however, EdPsych atomist models were under the critique of systemic models, people. And they were right also. So it cannot only be we have a laboratory in a regular classroom and doing our controlled studies, because they are systems, and systems play a big role also. So we move on. And then we had to deal with this huge problem of fidelity to the model or mutual adaptation. We are still within this one. It's very hard to move beyond that. We have colleagues who want fidelity of their models they develop, and there are other colleagues, and I'm part of that, who believe only in mutual adaptation. So this is where we are pretty much at this point. But what's extremely important is data. So of course today we hear a lot about evidence-based decision-making versus informed-based decision-making. Thanks God, we are beyond the quantitative research, but it wasn't like this, I'll tell you, in the early 80s. Now even, there was a time where we would do qualitative research after quantitative studies, but now it's almost the reversal. We start qualitative and then we try to bring quantitative results after that. But what I'm showing on this slide is not what's on the left-hand side, because I'm not that competent on that side, because I developed on the other side. I developed on the right-hand side during my own career. So what do we have as possibilities when we do research, but let's say research that's more on the minority side? Still alternative a bit. Well, we have reflection on action. We need data for that. We have collaborative action research. We need a lot of data for that. We have change lab, formative interventions, cultural historical activity theory. We need data for that. We have co-teaching, co-generative dialoguing. We need data for that to happen. We have design-based research now, because design experiment has evolved to become design-based research, and now it's design research, especially since the educational technology people have adopted design research. So all this is happening right now. And then we have design-based implementation research, DBIR, where you have partnership between research and practice. And now, more and more we hear that cultural activity theory is an activist and interventionist research. That's quite different than what it was 30 years ago. So this is pretty much when we have to talk about the big picture. This is what I'm suggesting as an alternative. To push that further, in Quebec City, at the end of August, we are going to have ISCAR 2017. It's the International Society for Cultural Activity Research, which have its Congress in Quebec City. And we will have almost a good number of the people who have helped build the foundation for the kind of approaches that I've mentioned. And the research center, and I have two colleagues here, I have Roland and Sylvie, and we have been working on developing this Congress for a number of years, and we hope that it's going to be an event in Canada, and for Quebec especially, where we had an educational reform that just almost capsized, you know. So we have to do it again. We have to go back to Vygotsky's work and relearn almost what happened there, and also all the methodologies that are connected to that. So this gives you an idea of the themes and sub-themes that are going to be part of that, and it has to do with collaborative research. It helps build the foundations for that. It has to do with intervention as well as research. Intervention informed by research. So let's talk a little bit about the paper now. but you have the introduction and the references are in the paper. Les défis de l'innovation selon la théorie de l'activité, le cas de l'école éloignée en réseau. Well, it had to do with teaching and learning with digital resources and tools. I've been doing that since the mid-90s, started with the Telelearning Network of Centers of Excellence, and we have been at it since then. What you're seeing here is something quite recent. It's a document by Ryerson report, but it's for the library people. And look at the movements in academic and research libraries these days. We can say a lot why we need inquiry-based learning, collaborative learning, but this is kind of interesting. This is how libraries are evolving. What you see in both images, it's almost this library here. It has changed quite a bit. It's no more individual cubicles, and now there are places to be alone, and you see that in the background, but you have places where together you work on problems. So more and more we are moving in this direction, and it's quite interesting to see the movements they see for academic and research libraries. How do we expand access and convenience? It's one question they're asking. How we spur innovation? How we foster authentic learning and discovery, Well, I wish more of my colleagues will ask the same questions. I wish more teachers will ask the same questions. But we have people on the side who are asking those questions, and they are librarians. What we have done in Quebec with the Remote Network School Network, we have developed partnerships. We call them Zoom partnerships. In English, it sounds right. In French, we have a hard time saying it that way. So it's only when I write in English that I can say it. And the first time I used that, I was in Singapore, so it felt right, Zoom. So school, university, government partnerships. Pretty much we need all these partners to make something happen. So what you see on this picture, you see our Quebec is very large, and all the red dots are the different reward schools where we have been working on. And the concept has been the following. In Quebec we could not have online courses for mandatory education. It was not allowed. The teacher union said no on the Francophone side. So we had the opportunity to take the hard road. It meant collaborative teaching and learning. So we took that road. But the big concept became, how do we develop a network classroom? And how we engage in collaborative activities, teachers and students, and knowledge building. I was working with Ryerson University, and we decided that knowledge building, knowing what we knew about what information technology could do for teaching and learning, we said we have to make the big jump. Of course, there were limits after that in terms of innovation, but we decided to go all the way. So imagine yourself being in a classroom where when you enter the classroom, you see this. We are a network classroom. And the little stars are the knowledge building principles that Martin Skadamaya is talking about so much. It was not happening every day, all year round, but there were moments of that, and this is what comes. There were many, many tensions and challenges along the way. So when we study the activity system, AAR means Remote Network School, l'école éloignée en réseau. So you see the different tensions and challenges that we had there. Technical choices to reconcile, roles and routines to surpass, pedagogies to develop, to conciliate community memberships. So in the article, you see a description of these different tensions. So when you move in those directions, trying to meet those challenges, well, you have to do a lot of boundary spanning. Here's a description of what boundary spanning is about. In terms of activity theory, it means an extension and a reconceptualization of the boundaries of the primary and secondary objects of interlinked activities in a way that connects them as part of a broader, partly shared object that the two activities jointly carry out. In this case, the primary object is student achievement and the secondary object is student success in the knowledge age. So I hope you won't see this picture in the article, but it gives you an idea of the kind of analysis we have been conducting. So at the middle, you have student achievement and student success in the knowledge age, and you see all the different elements in interplay with one another, the intersubjective zone, which is a potentially shared object. So we have been doing a lot of analysis of all of that. Deep understanding was easier to grasp than knowledge building. So it was, in activity theory terms, a second stimulus. Here are some defining moments associated with knowledge building. You know, students surpassing teachers in the number of questions asked to one another during online discourse. Students asking a broad variety of questions that called for extended answers on the part of their peers. Low achievers demonstrating best progress during inquiries, aim at deeper understanding of a question or problems. The poll results. The reading comprehension test. 1 minute? Almost there. Scaling. We had different models. The learning community model, the knowledge building community, and the network community of practice model. Well, we took Coburn and Diddy's analytical grade for that. So you see the 5 different criteria. So you see that in the article. So this is the figure that I came up with. It starts with co-design, many different iterations. You know, people who come in have to get familiar with that. Then all this needs to be adapted. Some of it gets consolidated and you start again. So no wonder why it's so hard. So the last report we came up with is this one, a socio-technical infrastructure for innovation to set, sustain, and scale innovation. Still very hard work, and we need to keep going. Why is it so hard? More recently, I have not discovered Engstrom that way. Probably I did not want to hear or read it and understand it fully. See what he says about innovation. And innovation occurs in an activity system when a culturally more advanced activity replaces the current activity. When do we do that as educational researchers? When do we achieve it? That's the size of the beast. That's the big picture. We want social innovation. This is why we are there. That's the challenge. Let's keep on the good work.
Is it okay to close this? All right, the floor is mine. I know I gave Katie and Nick a heart attack not coming to the last minute, but when you can't say no to Katie, because I really wanted to do this presentation, but I looked at my calendar when the calendar came out and I realized I was committed to Ottawa race weekend with my entire family, and so this morning I ran a half marathon and then got on a plane to come here. So the fact that I'm actually standing is fairly remarkable. I'm going to be talking less about my own research and in this short time just give you my impressions on the history of Canadian research, especially through the lens of the Canadian Journal of Education in the last 40 years, and then the future of education research and how that might affect education. So just so you're not waiting for anything other than that, that's what I'm doing. 40 years ago, the Summer Olympics were being held in Montreal. The CN Tower opened to the public, and Canadians were introduced to a bite-sized piece of fried dough called a Timbit. I Write the Songs by Barry Manilow hit #1 on the music charts, and Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs started a small company called Apple Computer in the garage of Jobs' parents' house in Cupertino, California. Those were monumental events, but what we really are impressed with is that same year, the Canadian Society for the Study of Education, Canada's premier association for professors, students, and researchers in education, published the first issue in January of 1976 of the Canadian Journal of Education. It
was distributed free of charge to all CSSE members, but non-members could buy it for $2. In his opening editorial, founding editor Ronald G. Ragsdale expressed his hope that Canadian educators would use CJE as, quote, a national forum for the exchange of ideas, a written record of the issues in education of concern to Canadians. The comparable U.S. publication, the American Educational Research Journal, had already been in print for a dozen years. Although both CJE and AERJ would become important to my future career as a professor, I have to confess that I was not aware of either when I began teaching middle school students in New York City public schools in the 1980s. Neither, I'm guessing, were my fellow teachers. Now, I have never been of the opinion that teachers must necessarily be avid consumers of peer-review education research journals, nor that researchers should write only for the broadest possible readership, regardless of the reader's training or interests. Depending on the journal, the language may be highly jargonized, highly specialized, and written for an audience of other researchers, not K-12 teachers, and I don't see any problem with that. I am, however, intrigued by the writing of Dr. A. Richard King, who 40 years ago was a professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Victoria. In a brief article in the first issue of CJE, King argued that the needs of teachers, administrators, and policymakers are seldom served by the kind of research on offer from professors of education. School personnel, he noted, want research outcomes that lead to new understandings and solutions to the educators' problems. Researchers, on the other hand, pursue academic respectability, quote, logical analysis, and an aura of objectivity. In a sentiment that seems as relevant today as it is when he wrote it, King summarized his concerns this way. Since the rewards available from research are top-heavy in favor of the researcher and all too often minimal or even negative for the educator, it's little wonder that the general climate for social science research in school systems has been one of suspicion, defensiveness, and recalcitrance. These are King's words. Now, that same year that CJE launched its first issue, 1976, Harold Howe II, the U.S. Commissioner of Education in the Lyndon Johnson administration, addressed members of the American Educational Research Association in a lecture titled Education Research, the Promise and the Problem. After sharing stories about his various roles in education, administration, and policy, Howe confessed that he had been, quote, continually perplexed by what education research was suggesting can be done to improve schools. He cites, for example, the famous 1966 Coleman report that probably many of you are familiar with, that had been used variously to oppose desegregation efforts and support them, to argue both for and increased funding for schools, and to bolster and refute the idea that schools do not have much to do with learning in the first place. Similarly, Fred Kerlinger, in his AERA presidential address, proclaimed that, quote, there is little direct connection between education research and practice. Now, that the very first issue of Canada's premier scholarly journal of education research would already contain an implicit critique of its own usefulness to schools should not surprise us. As the small sample above illustrates, questions about the impact of research on practice were already plentiful in this period, the 1970s. Moreover, in what appears to be recurrent cycles, the question of whether education research is useful for improving schools has continued to arise in the decades since, episodically across a broad array of English language education journals around the globe. And often a great deal of hand-wringing ensues over the disconnection between research and practice. In the mid-1980s, Stanford professor Elliot Eisner interviewed his own colleagues and found that not a single one of them, not one, could provide a convincing example of education research informing their teaching practice. And I wonder how many of us could provide such an example. If the people who conduct education research do not use their own research findings to guide practice in the institutions where they work, why should we expect teachers and school administrators to use research to guide theirs? In the 1990s, Carl Cassell published an article, and the title speaks for itself, The Awful Reputation of Educational Research. 10 years later, and across the Atlantic, former president of the British Educational Research Association, Peter Mortimer, quipped that, quote, "Educational research accumulates in great growing bulk with all manner of contradictory findings. If educational research did not exist," he concluded, "it would not be greatly missed." By the turn of the new millennium, articles, speeches, and conferences and debates about the uncertain impact of research results on education practice abounded. And these concerns, I think, could be summarized by Professor Robert McClintock, who commented in 2007 in the Teachers College Record, quote, "The vast quantity of educational research produced year in, year out serves no real need or opportunity in the workday world of schools." Now, although you may at this point in my talk be thinking otherwise, my point in cataloging these many periods of self-critique through the last 40 years of research and education is not to elevate those critiques at all, but rather to contextualize them. For as long as we have had schools, educators of all sorts have sought to improve the lives of students and improve society in substantive ways. The pages of CJE, like those of other leading education research journals around the world, brim with evidence of these kinds of efforts. But education is not rocket science. And by that I mean it's infinitely more complicated. Research on gravitational pull, jet propulsion, orbital speeds, and heat-resistant materials have goals far more easily defined, conditions far more predictable, and effects far more reproducible than any in most education subfields. There are, of course, many examples of shoddy education research, not by anyone in this room, of course, but often education research produces contradictory findings because questions vary, goals vary, conditions vary, and perhaps most importantly, children vary. The critiques of the impact on practice of research and education that I cited earlier should not be seen as an argument for the uselessness of such research, but rather a healthy frustration with how difficult it can be to solve educational problems. Indeed, there's considerable challenge in even defining the problems in the first place. You heard earlier I noted Harold Howe's critique of the questionable impact that research might immediately have on school practice, but I was a little disingenuous because he also went on to say this: "In education, the fundamental units with which we deal are individual human beings whose behavior is influenced by differing inheritances, by varied experiences in life, and by feelings and attitudes that are unpredictable and changing as life experiences change. Information about human beings cannot be put into computers with the expectation that calculations about them will have the same predictability that the laws of gravity will produce when fed into the same computers." So my point is that human behavior is infinitely complex, and therefore any empirical inquiry into human behavior will be so too. That's not an indictment of education research, but rather a celebration of it. Beginning with the first published issue and continuing through 4 decades, CJE has published articles on school reform, policy analysis, curricular improvements, educational access, bilingual education and multiculturalism, equity and social justice, religious education and privatization, language development and mathematical reasoning, historical thinking and scientific inquiry, students at risk and students at play, teacher recruitment and teacher development, school dropouts, and school uniforms. And this list only scratches the surface. These research areas do not denote problems to solve. They are signposts for domains of worthwhile inquiry. I don't think, though, that complexity is the only reason for the persistent gap between education studies, what they recommend, and what happens in schools. Even research findings that clearly indicate a need to do something differently do not affect immediately changes in policy or practice. That's because, as we all know, most policy decisions are made with greater reference to values, social norms, politics, and ideology than to any empirical evidence. And at the classroom level, of course, teachers' decisions are based on all of those, plus an extraordinary mix of experience, instinct, and human relationships. But, and this is the main point I wanted to make today, those values, social norms, and ideological commitments, the ways we interpret experience, and the ways we make sense of our human interactions and relationships are all, in turn, influenced by research studies. Discovering that math teachers call on and encourage boys more than girls shapes understandings and eventually changes the way that not only researchers but all of us think about girls in mathematics. Documenting that minority students are routinely sorted into vocational courses while their white peers from wealthier backgrounds are funneled into university-bound streams does not erase bias, but it does nudge us along a path toward equity. Both studies that emphasize the technical efficiency of using phonics to teach rudimentary reading and those studies that show the importance of holistic approaches to reading and writing teach us that literacy is a multidimensional construct, one that encompasses multiple and sometimes conflicting means and ends. There's a saying that the best teachers are those who show you where to look, but don't tell you what to see. And I'm suggesting that the same may be true for researchers. Researchers in education are rarely able to tell policymakers, teachers, administrators, or parents exactly what to see in a way that affects immediate change, but we are well equipped to show them where to look. In the article for CJE, I know I need to wrap up, I make what I call a modest proposal for direction of research in Canada that I think would draw on this ambiguity and also the ways that research affects the ways research affects practice. But I'm not going to go in that here because of time considerations. But I'm happy to elaborate in discussion. But I do think that as CJE enters its 41st year of publication, and with Donald Trump being elected President of the United States and Marie Le Pen being having been perilously close to a presidential victory in France, and a significant proportion of Dutch citizens who hope to have a country governed by nationalist Geert Wilders and his Party for Freedom, I do think that we have to give strong consideration to the ethical, political, and moral obligations of our work, and that was where my proposal comes from. In terms of the research, there'll always be pockets of success, right? Individual teachers, programs, schools, and even entire districts that embrace meaningful teaching and learning and that see membership in a community of citizens as an important educational goal. Of course, the end goal is for all schools to look that way, for all schools to embrace an education that matters. I think that may take a while. The influence of research will always be indirect. And yet the late playwright and statesman Václav Havel observed that hope is not the same as choosing struggles that are headed for quick success. Hope, he said, is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. Change does not happen at broadband speeds, and the influence of any one research study or even an entire field of inquiry is indirect and difficult to trace. But I think that knowing that we're all part of a timeless march towards these good goals makes much of what we do worthwhile. I'm going to close with a quote by the singer-songwriter Holly Near, who expressed this idea in her anthem to the many social change movements that have existed for as long as there have been things to improve. In her song, The Great Peace March, she sings, quote, "Believe it or not, as daring as it may seem, it's not an empty dream to walk in a powerful path, neither the first nor the last." And I think educators throughout Canada, both researchers and practitioners who hope to improve the educational experience for all children through their work might benefit from that kind of knowledge. If I could hope for one certainty in their efforts and our efforts, it would be this: the knowledge, whether in the face of immediate successes or setbacks, or more indirect influence on children, schools, and society, that all of us are walking in a powerful and worthwhile path. Thank you.
We have time for questions. 5 minutes, and then maybe a discussion among the three presenters.
We were all teachers, we know about wait time.
Well, I have a question. So listening to each other, how would that inform how you think about your piece in the special caption?
Well, I have a question for you. What do we know about teacher-educator professional learning?
So we were talking about this before we did our formal we were talking about this before we did our formal presentation. So Thérèse was asking me about, for those of us who are working faculties of education, and partly to your point around, as researchers, do we use research in our own practice? So while many of us have perhaps been classroom teachers, have we used research around adult learning and development in our work as professors? So and I was saying, actually my first faculty position was at the Institute of Education at the University of London, and that was at the time when you got hired as a new faculty member, you actually had to go and do a certification in adult learning as part of your faculty appointment, and that was been really beneficial. So actually thinking about the theories of learning and how you bring them in. But I think, do you want to comment further? I think this is a big issue, and I know you have some questions.
Yeah, the question is, what do we do about it?
Yeah.
What can we do about it? And I think if we do nothing about it, and if maybe we need a special issue of CJE about it.
Yeah.
It remembers me of the OMS group, the effort in the late 80s and early 90s. They came out with, they had just closed the Department of Education where Dewey was at, in Chicago, University of Chicago, and then they came up with tomorrow's teachers, and at the time they thought a number of faculties of education would close. So the deans got together and they became the home group, and they wrote Tomorrow's Teachers. And then after that, we had Tomorrow's Schools, and then Tomorrow's Schools of Education. We had Judith Linear here at CSSE when it was in Montreal in 95, I think, or 94, and we talk about it, but it's like the whole thing collapsed afterwards. But a lot was said at the time, and it's like we have to see it again. And until we get tired of, our own practices, how will things change?
I'll say one thing about teacher professional development. I was just reading Pasi Sahlberg's updated book. He started with Finnish lessons about the Finnish education system, and he now came out with Finnish lessons 2.0. And I'm really struck by, Canada and the U.S. has this love affair about looking at Finland because they scored in the top of the PISA scores. And even though the Finnish education leaders said, I know we scored in the top PISA scores, but we don't care if we dropped, next time. And both the U.S. and Canada look to them and say, oh my God, we need to be more competitive like the Finns. And so, what should we do? And then they proceed to go and do everything exactly the opposite of everything that exists in the Finnish public education system. The Finnish public education system has absolutely no standardized tests. In some areas, they have a spot check graduation tests, but that's it. And most important, and here's where it's relevant to teacher professional development, they put immense faith and trust in their teachers. Teachers have high status. It's a very desirable job. It's extremely competitive, and they have a next to zero attrition rate. Many of you probably know that in the U.S., 50% of teachers leave teaching within the first 5 years, and in Canada, it's about a third, depending on the province, who leave within the first 5 years. In Finland, it's next to zero, and that's, of course, because the Finnish teachers are educated and developed as professionals who are in charge of their own trade and in charge of their own practice, and who can draw on their own passions and experience to make the best kind of education they can for children. So I think that we need to, at every opportunity, point out to policymakers here in Canada that what teachers need is the best possible working conditions to do their trade, time for professional development, involving them in professional development, and then getting out of their way to let them do their job.
And what about teacher educators?
Yeah, teacher educators, absolutely. I mean, I think teacher educators need to be partners in that trade. Of course, we have expertise that teachers don't have, and teachers have expertise that we don't have from direct classroom experience, even if we were teachers, and we need to partner those ideas. But of course, we never can come in with, the answer for teacher work. I think there's a question there, Nick.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed your talks very much. I'd like to come in on that at the risk of sounding immodest, I think we had great success working with teachers in a very long hand-in-glove project from York University. My name is Heather Lotherington, working at Joyce Public School. We worked over a decade, and we changed things entirely, and it was great. The problem is that how do you move it from there to policy? And policy, as far as I could, policymakers just want to know where the votes were, and parents, all the parents we worked with were, I work with language, and so they were all immigrants, very recent immigrants, 90% of the school, and so they don't speak English, and so they want to speak English. So all our stuff with plurilingualism that was so exciting, and the kids were doing really well and everything, the parents are still coming in with, we want to learn English, and so there was this kind of terrible battle with, we know how to do this, we don't know how to give it, we give it away in articles, and then I end up exactly where you're talking from, like who reads them, and where do you go from there? Some people do, but right in the city that I work in Toronto, it's the same sort of, by the way, we've been doing that for 15 years, we have that expertise. We'd be delighted to show you if you were interested. So what do you have to say about that? How do you get help there?
I was handed the mic, so I guess I'm going first. Thank you. I'm going to say two things. The piece around Finland, when we were working on the Educators Professional Learning in Canada study, we released the first version of the report in December at the Learning Forward conference, and actually Pasi Salberg was with us. Whatever you think of PISA, it was just one of these moments when we were releasing a study saying about the importance of teachers in Canada. On the day that the last PISA results, Canada is number 1 in reading in the OECD. We overtook Finland. In the world, Singapore is ahead of us. And so Pasi made the joke that now Canada will receive all the EDUR tourists and Finland will win the world hockey, so we can see how these things happen. The piece around how do we get policymakers to listen? In the work, I really think it's about showcasing success as well as the challenges as much as possible. So where are those promising practices? How do we show them? How do we demonstrate them? How do we enable schools to deprivatise their practice? And how can we as researchers, for those of us that are researchers, support that to happen? One of my other areas is knowledge mobilisation, and there are several people in the room that are working in that area. And what we're finding is that it's usually not the research report, it's social interaction. It's opportunities like this to actually have the conversation. It's opportunities to invite people in to actually see the work in practice. It's developing, those short summaries, those examples. So thinking around the multi-pronged strategy of how you're going to get that piece. With policymakers, if parents are talking about something positively, that carries a huge influence. If you're able to get them to see it in practice, that can have an influence. So, I would say most of the time we've been able to influence policy, it's actually by developing relationships over a long time where you're having conversations. How do you get your research into the conversation? And I think that would be my advice.
Well, I will say a few words on this tension between evidence-based decision-making versus informed-based decision-making. I think it's important that we don't play les données probantes, thinking that we have evidence-based decision-making and it's going to happen that way in different contexts. I think if we play that game, it's a dead end in the end. We may have strong research results, but in a specific context, things are going to be different. And we have to recognize the will of the people in the school, and it is context-based. It will inform the reflective process, the decision-making in schools, but we should not play the game of saying we have evidence-based research. We can't just let people know about it and it will make a difference. Because right now, this is the dominant language.
I have to choose my words carefully because it seems like you're only going to hear every seventh or something. To put the meaningless words when the mic turns off. I agree, and I wanted to say two things, Heather. One is that I think the whole notion of scaling up is overrated, right? There are many of us working with schools and doing great work with great teachers and getting great results. And the idea that we have to then spread it to the province or, spread it to is part of the kind of standardization mindset, like the same program. I mean, your program works because you're passionate and you have deep personal involvement in it. It doesn't mean that it would work exactly the same way somewhere else. So the whole idea of scaling up, I think, is a little problematic instead of fostering many flowers to bloom. But then the other thing I wanted to say is that in terms of affecting policy, we have to recognize that that's political work, not research work. Policymakers have absolutely no interest in what the education research says about something unless it agrees with their political agenda. And, we can see this in the U.S., the massive, and this will, I love the U.S. is always like a little crystal ball for what's going to seep across the border in a slightly different form into Canada. And the crystal ball right now is that there are opt-out movements sweeping across almost every state, driven mostly by parents and teacher groups that are calling into question the usefulness of having kids come home in tears when they're 7 years old because of spending 3 months preparing for standardized tests. Here in Ontario, we probably have one of the standardized testing systems that most mimics some of the kind of high-stakes standardized testing in the U.S., even though they're not high stakes here. And I think that that's going to change when the political work is done. So I think we have to wear many hats. We work in schools, and I think we also have to do political work, and I think that teachers have to do that kind of political work too, and we can do everything we can to help allow that to happen.
And then Margaret after.
Hello. I'm very excited to be here. I drove from Renfrew County to be here for just the 1 hour. And I have to say that you're all incredibly inspirational. I'm a teacher, an elementary teacher for many years. My background's in research, and my journey is to go into educational research as a teacher. So I'm looking for those connections. So what you said today is absolutely incredible. Incredible. It definitely gives us hope. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, on that closing note, Nick.
Another question?
You got one more question, Joel. Had I known.
Hi, I'm Margaret McIntyre-Latta, UBC Okanagan. I have a question about when you're thinking about research and informing classrooms and teachers, what's the role across all of your ideas for research to become the language, the theorizing language that helps teachers articulate what they're doing and why, orienting why, and what they're orienting away from? Because that's not something I deliberately heard in your papers, and I think that is a place for research that is often undermined and not understood by teachers, by the community, by teacher educators, by the research generally, and I think there's something really powerful there.
Yeah, I love that comment. I think that we do need to do a lot of work to help teachers understand the usefulness of theory. Of course, theory is never going to drive everything. Their own experience is going to take precedence in a lot of places, and often, they're right to do that. But I'm reminded of, I gave this talk in Brazil, and it was one of these huge auditoriums with thousands of teachers, and then they were televising it to other places, and there was a bunch of us speaking. It was their major conference, once-a-year conference, and this French philosopher, I don't remember his name, was speaking, and I just remember he was out of central casting, and he kept saying "l'épistème," and it was just all theory that it had almost nothing to do with schools. And I thought, oh my God, this guy doesn't know his audience. They're going to be falling under. And I look around, and all thousands of teachers are riveted, taking notes, starved for this kind of high theory philosophy. And so it's a bit of a cultural problem, right? We don't, in North America, we don't pay much attention to theory unless we're researchers and theoreticians, and people aren't that interested. So it's an uphill battle because it's not built into our culture. But I do think that making sure teachers have the time to engage with ideas and big question thinking is important. And of course, like you said, in teacher education is certainly where we get to do some of that, and we have to face the questions of how am I going to use that on Monday morning in my class? And I often start some of my classes saying that nothing you learn in my class is going to be useful Monday morning in your class, but this is the only time, for now, for a long time, that you'll get to ask these big questions and think about the purpose of schooling. And so, yeah, thanks.
I think that one avenue for that is collaborative research. When we choose a problem together, and then when we give one another space to talk about it. And there are times when there is an openness for that. But you have to choose what you say, and it's hard work, but I think it's the only way to really go somewhere with it. And it's the same thing when you supervise a student, doing the practical, When is it that you come up with the right concept at the right time?
Thank you. Thank you, Margaret. The piece, there's a whole movement around what works, and evidence-based decision-making and randomized control trials and all of these pieces. And the question isn't what works. The question is what matters, for whom, in what context, under what circumstances, with what consequences. And these are deeper questions. So when we think about how does research or evidence get into practice, it's about a process of awareness that this research exists. But the key thing is about understanding, actually being able to critique the research, look at it. Does it make sense? Does it add up? Does it not make sense? What's the author's background and bias and all of these questions? And then in the terms of knowledge mobilization is the sharing piece, so the collaborative conversations, the inquiry, the learning communities, and then whether you're going to act on it or not act on it. And my worry is that in some of the debates at the moment it's what's the research and how do we use it, without those understanding conceptual pieces in the midst of it. And certainly in the teacher professional learning work, what we're seeing is that for teachers, once they get further into their career, those conceptual questions and theoretical questions become more important around social justice and equity. So once you're out the survival mode of the first couple of years of teaching, and I think these are important. And I would like to say that for those of us that are on the political work, there is some appetite for research as well. For those of you that know me, I do work here in Ontario with our politicians. So I think that, as we think about our research community, it's like all things. It's where are we the strongest? Some of us are the brilliant speakers or the writers or the teachers, or some of us are the brilliant political people. And how do we find those champions and intermediaries? And I do think, I loved your quote about the path forward. And it's not about being at the front or at the back. But so who is it that you can connect with to bring about the changes? And how do we enable teachers to connect with each other, but also how do we influence political voices? And I think if we can think about that, not that each of us has to do all of that, but as a community that we can try and move forward, we can have some influence, I would hope.
Thank you. So just on behalf of everyone who came today, I'd like to thank our panelists. So Joel, Thérèse, and Carol, thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today, and thank you for making a significant contribution to the special issue. But I'd also like to take a moment just to thank Roland Delande and Ted Christou and Chris DeLuca and the managing editor and the board, the editorial board, for conceptualizing this, but also making our journal a robust place, a viable place, a stable place for you to share your work. So thank you.